What actually turns an outboard engine into a legendary machine? Raw horsepower, bulletproof reliability, or the moment it forced the entire industry to rethink what was possible on the water? We are counting down the 15 best American outboard engines ever made, not by hype or specs alone, but by the impact they had on real boats and real owners. And to find that answer, we have to go back to the first engine that quietly crossed a line. The moment American outboards stopped playing it safe and started chasing speed. In the late 1950s, most outboards behaved like well-trained pets. The Mercury Mark 75 was more like someone unclipping a greyhound at a picnic. An inline-six on a family boat felt excessive, and Mercury knew it. This engine existed to answer a cheeky question: what happens if we stop pretending boaters don't want speed? Old owners still laugh about the sound. Not a shriek, not a bark, a smooth automotive hum, like a car engine that took a wrong turn and ended up at the marina. Push the throttle and it didn't panic, it leaned in. For people used to twins and triples, that surge felt like cheating, the boating equivalent of finding an extra gear that wasn't listed in the manual. The Mark 75 also set a tone: Mercury's racing obsession, secret testing, and don't ask, just win attitude all trace back here. It didn't need to be sensible. It needed to prove a point, and it did. And once Mercury showed 6 cylinders could live happily on the water, the next engine decided subtlety wasn't worth the effort. If the Mark 75 felt like a bold experiment, the Evinrude Starflite 75 felt like OMC clearing its throat and saying, "Alright, our turn." This thing had presence. Big cowling, wide stance, and a V4 layout that made docks feel slightly smaller. You didn't walk past a Starflite, you noticed it first. The magic wasn't just horsepower, it was confidence. The V4 delivered its power like a pickup truck instead of a sports car. Steady pull, less drama, and a sense that the engine wasn't working very hard at all. One owner joked that the motor looked like it could scare the waves flat before the hull even arrived. That mattered, because boats were getting heavier and trips were getting longer. The Starflite made big power feel normal, even responsible. Suddenly, more engine than you need became a selling point, not a warning label. But while OMC was scaling up with complexity and cylinders, another philosophy was quietly holding its ground, because the next engine proves that sometimes less really was more. The Johnson Super Seahorse 40 is the engine your uncle still talks about while pointing at an old photo and saying that thing never quit. No drama, no flash, just a big twin that showed up every weekend and did its job without complaining. It wasn't fast, and it didn't pretend to be, but it started when others sulked, ran on questionable fuel, and tolerated maintenance schedules best described as optimistic. For fishermen, workboat owners, and families, that mattered more than top speed bragging rights. There's a reason so many of these engines survived. Simple systems meant fewer surprises, and parts were everywhere. If something did go wrong, odds are the fix involved basic tools and mild swearing, not a specialist. The Super Seahorse 40 reminds us that progress isn't always louder or faster. Sometimes it's just dependable enough to earn trust year after year, but not everyone was content with playing it safe, and the engine coming up next brought a little attitude back into the mix. If the Super Seahorse was the dependable co-worker, the Scott Atwater 40 was the loud guy who still somehow got results. Scott didn't just sell engines, they sold confidence, sometimes bordering on showmanship. Flying Scots in ads, bold claims, and a motor that felt like it wanted to be noticed. The puzzle with the Scott Atwater 40 is this: if it wasn't the quietest, the smoothest, or the prettiest, why did owners love them so much? The answer was attitude. These engines felt eager, throttle response was sharp, and they had a reputation for punching above their weight, like a middleweight boxer who never backed down. Old owners joke that Scots ran best when you treated them like they were indestructible. Overthink them and they'd sulk, use them hard and they seemed happier for it. That personality made them memorable, even decades later. Scott Atwater proved that an outboard didn't need to be refined to be respected, it just needed to feel alive. And if you think that was bold, the next engine doubled down on personality, and even put it in the name. The West Bend Shark 35 sounds like it should have come with warning labels and racing stripes. In reality, it was a clever blend of marketing bravado and everyday usability. West Bend knew most buyers weren't engineers, they were people who liked the idea of owning something that sounded fast. The Shark name did half the work. Owners still laugh that the engine felt quicker just because of the badge. But here's the twist, it actually backed it up. The Shark 35 had a reputation for crisp throttle response and a willingness to rev, making small boats feel bigger than they were. Think of it like a terrier on a leash. Compact, energetic, and always pulling forward. It wasn't about raw horsepower, it was about feel. That made it popular with younger boaters and weekend speed chasers who wanted excitement without complexity. West Bend understood something early. Emotion sells engines too. But what happens when excitement meets serious engineering? The next engine answered that with 6 cylinders stacked sky high. By the time Mercury's inline-six 115 arrived, subtlety had officially left the marina. Nicknamed the Tower of Power, this engine looked like a skyscraper bolted to your transom, and that visual alone told a story. Mercury wasn't chasing balance anymore. They were chasing dominance. Here's the question this engine raises. How did something so tall, so narrow, and so unconventional work so well? The answer was smoothness. 6 cylinders firing in harmony delivered power like a conveyor belt instead of a punch. Owners said it felt like the engine never ran out of breath, just kept pulling. It also sounded different. Less chainsaw, more straight-six sedan. That made long runs feel effortless, even when the speedometer said otherwise. The Tower of Power became shorthand for serious boating, the kind where people nodded quietly instead of bragging. This engine didn't just move boats faster, it changed what boaters expected from refinement. And once that expectation was set, OMC knew it had to respond in kind. If Mercury's Tower of Power felt tall and refined, the Evinrude V4 Crossflow 115 felt wide, stubborn, and quietly confident. This engine didn't try to impress you at idle. It waited until the boat was loaded, the water got rough, and the day got long. Then it showed its hand. Here's the puzzle with the Crossflow V4. On paper, it shouldn't have the legendary reputation it earned, yet owners still talk about them the way farmers talk about old tractors. They pulled hard, ran cool, and tolerated abuse that would have sent more delicate engines into early retirement. Miss a service, bad fuel, heavy hull, the Crossflow just shrugged and kept going. Think of it like a cast-iron diesel truck in a world moving toward sports cars. Not glamorous, but deeply trusted. That trust mattered because boating wasn't just about speed anymore. It was about reliability offshore, with family on board. But while OMC was perfecting durability, another American brand went in a completely different direction, because the next engine chased value and brute force, even if it raised a few eyebrows. The Chrysler 105 is one of those engines people love arguing about. Ask 5 owners and you'll get 6 opinions. That alone tells you it mattered. Chrysler wasn't trying to build the most refined outboard, they were trying to build the most horsepower for the money, full stop. The question is simple. Did they succeed? In many ways, yes. The 105 delivered strong torque, simple mechanics, and a price that made competitors uncomfortable. It was the engine you bought when you wanted to go fast without asking permission. One owner joked that it felt like Chrysler sold you the engine first and the instructions later. That rough around the edges personality became part of its charm. These motors rewarded hands-on owners, the kind who didn't mind tuning, tweaking, and learning by doing. Treat it right and it would surprise you. Ignore it, and it would remind you who was boss. Chrysler proved affordability could still mean performance, and that same philosophy would soon filter into engines sold under different names altogether. The Gale Buccaneer 35 is a reminder that not every great American outboard wore a famous badge. Gale was OMC's quieter sibling, often sold through department stores and catalogs, which makes the Buccaneer's reputation even more interesting. Here's the twist: many owners didn't even realize they were buying OMC engineering. They just knew the engine worked. The Buccaneer 35 was simple, dependable, and unintimidating, the kind of motor you trusted your first long summer with. It's like buying a store-brand tool that secretly came from the same factory as the premium one. That accessibility mattered. It brought boating to people who might have been priced out otherwise, without sacrificing reliability. The Buccaneer didn't shout. It quietly did its job and earned loyalty through reputation, not spectacle. Gale proved that great engines didn't always need headlines, but affordability and simplicity would soon take on a much louder, more controversial form in the engines that followed. If the Gale Buccaneer proved quiet competence could win trust, the Force 120 showed what happens when affordability stops whispering and starts shouting. This engine had a reputation long before most buyers even turned the key. Some called it crude, others called it honest. Both were probably right. Here's the puzzle: how did an engine so often criticized end up powering so many boats for so many years? The answer is simple. It worked, and it was cheap enough to forgive. The Force 120 was like a basic pickup with roll-up windows. No luxury, no illusions, just torque and momentum. Owners joked that it rewarded confidence more than finesse. For hands-on boaters, that was part of the appeal. You learned the engine because you had to, and once you did, it stuck with you. Plenty of Force motors outlived expectations simply because their owners understood them. Force proved that refinement isn't always the goal. Sometimes access is. But what happens when raw value collides with serious engineering ambition? The next engine answered that very loudly. The OMC Loop-Charged V6 225 was not subtle, and it never tried to be. This was OMC stepping fully into the muscle era, where horsepower numbers mattered and restraint was optional. Compared to earlier engines, this felt like skipping straight to the final boss. The twist here is efficiency. Despite the size and aggression, loop charging actually made better use of fuel and airflow. On paper, it was smarter. On the water, it felt ferocious. Owners described it like a strong current. You didn't notice how fast you were going until you looked back. This engine changed boat design. Transoms got stronger, hulls got faster. Conversations shifted from "do I need this much power" to "how soon can I get it?" It was loud, confident, and slightly intimidating, in the best way. OMC proved brute force and engineering could coexist, but not every revolution comes from going bigger. Sometimes it comes from going completely against the grain. The Homelite Bearcat 55 feels like the oddball in this lineup, and that's exactly why it matters. While everyone else chased louder, faster, smokier power, Homelite quietly asked a strange question. What if an outboard behaved more like a car engine? This was a 4-stroke in a 2-stroke world, and early reactions were mixed. Heavier, quieter, and different. The Bearcat confused people, but give it time and it won them over. Owners compared it to a slow-burning log fire. Not flashy, but steady, reliable, and oddly comforting. The real twist is hindsight. What once felt strange now looks prophetic. Smooth running, cleaner operation, and longevity weren't weaknesses, they were previews of the future. The Bearcat didn't shout for attention, it waited for history to catch up. Homelite proved innovation doesn't always arrive with applause, and with that groundwork laid, the engines coming next would blend refinement and performance in ways nobody could ignore. After the Bearcat quietly hinted at the future, Mercury decided it was time to make that future feel fast. The Mercury 200 EFI arrived with a simple promise: keep the excitement, remove the drama. Fuel injection changed the relationship owners had with high-performance outboards almost overnight. Here's the question this engine answers: What if a powerful outboard just behaved itself? Cold starts became predictable, throttle response felt cleaner, sharper, more intentional. Owners joked it was like going from a temperamental carburetted muscle car to one that finally learned some manners without losing its bite. The 200 EFI earned its reputation the hard way, through use. Long runs felt smoother, high speeds felt less stressful, and for many boaters, this was the first time performance didn't mean constantly listening for something going wrong. It made speed approachable. This engine also marked a shift in expectations. Once you experienced EFI reliability, there was no going back. The bar had been raised, quietly, but permanently. And once electronics entered the conversation, the next engine asked an uncomfortable question. How far is too far? The 7 Marine 557 didn't feel like an outboard. It felt like a dare. A supercharged V8 hanging off a transom looked absurd until it moved. This engine wasn't built to be sensible or subtle. It existed to see what would happen if excess was taken seriously. Most people remember the sound first. Not marine, not familiar, more like someone started a muscle car vertically. Mariners went quiet when one fired up. Conversations paused. Physics suddenly felt negotiable. One observer joked it looked like the engine was towing the boat, not the other way around. The puzzle is why it mattered despite never being common. Because it proved something important. Boaters wanted extremes. Once that idea was out in the open, major manufacturers couldn't ignore it. The 557 didn't need longevity, it needed impact. 7 Marine showed what was possible when limits were ignored, and once that door was kicked open, Mercury walked through it, with factory backing and zero hesitation. The Mercury V12 600 Verado feels less like an engine and more like a statement. 12 cylinders, 600 horsepower, a powerhead so wide it makes older outboards look like toys. This wasn't Mercury chasing headlines. It was Mercury declaring the top of the mountain officially occupied. The twist is refinement. Despite the size, the V12 behaves with surprising calm. Smooth delivery, quiet confidence, and an almost industrial sense of control. Owners compare it to a luxury locomotive. Massive, unstoppable, but never rushed. This engine answers the final question. What happens when outboards stop competing with each other and start competing with inboards? The V12 doesn't just push boats faster, it changes how builders design them and how owners think about propulsion. It's the logistical endpoint of a journey that started with curiosity and ended with dominance. So now you know that American outboards didn't evolve in a straight line. They zigzagged through excess, simplicity, mistakes, and breakthroughs, and every engine on this list left a real fingerprint on the water. If you enjoy these kinds of grounded, story-driven breakdowns of what actually made engines legendary, subscribing simply makes sure you don't miss the next one. And if this video got you thinking more about longevity than outright power, the perfect follow-up is 15 American boat engines that lasted forever.